Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for the next episode of Ships of War, the series where I look at historic warships, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes the downright notorious. And what I aim to do in this program is to, on the one hand, try and situate them in their historic context, and also at the same time look at how they've been presented in a particular game system and really just try to judge how fairly they have been treated by said game system. And following on from my previous videos, it's probably no surprise that I'm going to pick on the 1970s Avalon Hill classic Victory in the Pacific. And having a huge choice of heavy hitters and famous warships in that game, I have decided I would like to do aircraft carriers again, as you can see, but I've decided to ignore the big burly fleet types and instead look at a couple of small and to some very obscure but also nonetheless very important ships. So the ones I'm picking on today are the British carrier HMS Hermes and the Japanese carrier HIJMS Hosho. Now, before I dive into the history of the two ships, just a bit of house cleaning. In my last video, I'd said I was going to experiment with a two-parter format for this series. And within a minute or two of uploading that video, I sort of regretted it because it occurred to me, looking back at some of the others, that of course, depending on the choice of ship and how the game system treats them, there tends to be more or less that you could say from video to video. So I've stepped back from that decision, and rather than straitjacketing myself, I am just going to let this flow, as I will do with all the upcoming videos. And if it ends up being a two-parter, so be it. If I can cram everything into a single recording, then so be it. So let's get on with this one. So the quick reminder in terms of how Victory in the Pacific arranges its ship ratings. The number in the top right-hand corner is the air wing attack strength. That's how many dice you roll in battle. Hosho's is circled, indicating that the Japanese get a +1 bonus, reflecting skilled aircrew. And moving from left to right, the numbers at the bottom of the counter are the surface combat gunnery factor, the vessel's defensive value, basically call it survivability. It's an amalgamation of their flotation and armor protection. And the last number is an abstraction of the vessel's speed. So on the face of it, these carriers seem pretty well matched. And how fair is that? Well, that brings me very nicely to the beginning of our story today. Now, in many respects, the lives of the Hermes and the Hosho are weirdly parallel. They have much the same experiences. They're designed at the same time. And they both assist their own navies greatly to a degree that's not often acknowledged in the development of their frontline aircraft carrier forces. And in fact, if Hermes had survived the Second World War, they may well have had completely parallel careers and been scrapped at exactly the same time. But of course, Hermes, as we shall see, was destined to be lost in the spring of 1942. Weirdly enough, Hosho steamed out for her last ever combat mission in June of 1942. So, or at least intentional combat mission, I should say. So there was there's a lot that the two ships have in common. And this is very important because they both actually sprang in many important respects from the same wellspring of naval thought. Because both, I mean, Hermes, of course, was directly designed by the British, but Hosho owes a lot of her existence to British ideas and British thinking. Now, in order to tell this part of their story, I've got to go back to 1918, the very last year of the Great War. And this year is important in the story of carrier aviation generally because it found the British fleet in possession of the world's largest and most proficient aircraft carrier forces. From very humble beginnings just before the 1914, the British had surged ahead in naval aviation technology and also, of course, the ships required to support it. Now, they had encountered a lot of dead ends and made a lot of mistakes on the way. But by 1918, this formidable force was not only very large, possessing everything from very large aircraft carriers in the form of ships like Argus and Furious, all the way down to the hard-working but humble seaplane carriers, which were mostly converted cross-channel steamers, but some were being introduced that were purpose-built. And not only did these very capable, for the time, ships operate a plethora of different naval aircraft, but they were also, to varying degrees, combat experienced. Elements of the embryonic fleet air arm operating from ships had fought in the North Sea and the Mediterranean. And in fact, when the armistice was declared, the British were actually planning a mass carrier strike on the German high seas fleet. Now, from a purely academic perspective, had that raid gone ahead, the results would have been very interesting indeed. Now, the Japanese in 1918 were nowhere near the Royal Navy in terms of proficiency or numbers, but they had been watching very carefully from the sidelines. Now, this is not to say the Japanese had not experimented with naval aircraft. In fact, the honor of launching the first naval airstrike of the war goes to the Japanese when two of their Farman seaplanes from the tender Wakamiya had bombed German positions at Qingdao in 1914. So, right at the start of the war. And in another telling indicator of the way the Japanese were experimenting and innovating, Wakamiya's planes attempted in 1916 a mock nighttime torpedo strike on their own fleet in harbour. It was nothing more than a flyover with intent, but it was still very important. So by the end of the war, the Japanese were very keen to catch up and to benefit from the British experience. And of course, the British were still just about a very close ally. So at the time that HMS Hermes was being designed, literally as the First World War was ending, the British Sempil technical mission was over in Japan, assisting them not just with the procurement and design of new aircraft, but with the development of a new aircraft carrier. And although Hermes, almost the world's first purpose-designed aircraft carrier, was laid down first in the building yard, it was Hosho that was narrowly completed first. So construction on HMS Hermes began in 1919 and that on Hosho in 1921. But Hosho was launched and later completed by 1922, whereas Hermes was a couple of years behind, being officially completed in 1924. Now I'm just going to, bashing my camera, sorry. I'm just going to bring on these sketches that I have borrowed from Conway's All the World's Fighting Ships because they make for a very interesting comparison of the two vessels. Bearing in mind what I've said about how they both are from the same wellspring of naval thought. Sorry, I must stop being so clumsy. So looking at the profiles first, and these drawings are to scale, you get very different looking ships. And one thing that strikes me, at any rate, is how much more modern the Hermes looks when compared to Hosho. Now, there's little clues that they are both first generation proper aircraft carriers, but Hermes does hide it better. And that's because the British, when it came to Hermes, they were drawing on their experience. And although there was still a lot of debate relative to the Japanese, they had much firmer ideas about what they wanted. Also, although Hosho was in many respects a purpose-built carrier, her keel had actually been laid for the construction of a tanker, which ironically enough was meant to have been called Hiryu. So interesting that it's a Japanese carrier that gets that name later. Now, if you want to have another striking difference, let's flip these slightly and have a look at their flight deck arrangements, because that is very interesting too. Again, with Hermes, we get what I'd consider to be a much more modern layout, given how early this carrier was designed. Hosho was quite innovative, reflects quite a bit of the thinking of the time about how you use the space. And of course, the wider aft end of the flight deck is actually quite handy. It was believed at the time that it made it easier for pilots to land. It tapers partly to avoid wind resistance, but also to give them something to sort of aim at on their approach. But that extra width there is also very useful for aircraft handling. Now, the story, of course, with Hermes is completely different. She's got what by later standards would be considered a much better proportioned flight deck. So on commissioning, both these ships were put immediately into experimental service with their respective navies, and lessons were very quickly learned. Now, one of the lessons that was learned with Hermes was one that could not have been anticipated, and it's that relative to faster carriers like Furious, she was all right for fleet work, but there was a danger that she would be left behind on account of her speed of 25 knots. That was perfectly respectable when she was designed, but carriers moved on very quickly. Hosho had very much the same problems. But the Japanese learned a lot of lessons which took them in divergent directions from the British. So of course, when Hosho's completed, she has an island superstructure, which is fairly conventional. Unlike Hermes, she has funnels that could be angled away from the flight deck, cranked down a sort of 45-degree angle, sorry. And that was to clear the flight deck of smoke interference. Now, already that's an indication the Japanese were a little behind the British in their thinking, because the Brits had already come to the conclusion that if you wanted to eliminate the problems of funnel gases, you just made sure you put the funnel in an offset island location, and you still had a big enough patch of clear air to not cause interference to incoming planes. The Japanese were being extra careful about this, but this rather complex arrangement made for additional machinery and pipe work, and therefore problems of weight. So moving the drawings along a bit, I just want to bring out some photographs because it's always nice looking at the ships as they were. So this is Hermes, of course, when she was really quite new. Sorry, I really must stop doing that. And this picture really brings out the massive, for her time, massive island superstructure. Now, the Brits were well ahead of their time with something this big. And it reflects Hermes' role as a test bed for future designs, because the bigger carriers in service, Argus, Furious, did not have anything like this level of complexity. So you had room for a bridge, you had extra control positions, you had ready accommodation for pilots, can call it a ready room and briefing room, so that they could be quickly got to their planes. They didn't have to sort of find their way around the ship. If you wanted them in a ready area, this provided that. She had really, really roomy command and control facilities. But for all the ultra-modernity, there were also elements of her design that were a bit of a throwback. So you see these weapons along the side. These are her 5.5-inch guns. And if you're tempted to wonder if that very heavy structure up there is a flight operations center. I'm afraid you'd be wrong. It's the range taking and director tower to govern the training of these weapons here. It's completely independent of air operations, or at least it was when the ship was completed. So, in keeping with the Royal Navy's expectations, and to be fair, other people's, that a ship would have to be able to defend itself from surface attack, even if it was an aircraft carrier, then, you know, there is this wonderful coexistence of the gunnery role with the air control role. But despite that, this ship was very much a step in the right direction for the British. And here forward, you can see the light anti-aircraft guns. Those are 4 inches. So it's quite a heavy anti-aircraft armament for its day. I'll just bring up another one because here, this is taken slightly later, this photo, but it gives you another view of the island superstructure, which really is Hermes' big selling point. Again, you can see the immensely heavy supports for that gun director tower. But also, I mean, look at that. Bearing in mind this was designed as 1919, well, no, actually earlier than that, as 1918 was giving way to 1919. That is a hugely modern looking and, you know, emphasis on huge command and control structure. And if I am lingering on this particular detail of the ship, it's for very good reasons, because this thing really made Hermes very important. And when you look at the completion of later conversions like Eagle, well, Eagle was actually being converted while Hermes was being built, but she benefits from some of the lessons learned here. We've got the other features that I'd mentioned previously. There's the 5.5 inches. They're the very well-sighted 4-inch high-angle guns, because in an age where many aircraft carriers, many developing carriers around the world, were having their heavy anti-aircraft guns sighted where these 5.5s are, Hermes was one of the earliest to have flight deck level heavy guns. And this is important because it meant that these guns could fire across the flight deck. So your gun positioned here would be able to engage incoming aircraft either on the port or starboard side. If they'd been positioned down here, then they basically would have only been engaging aircraft coming into starboard. So that is a huge advance. And when you consider that some aircraft carriers, as late as World War II, are still having anti-aircraft guns placed on the sides of the hull, the Japanese are particularly offenders in this regard. It's a very advanced design. The derrick there was for plane handling and various other purposes, but essentially there was an expectation that seaplanes as well as wheeled aircraft would be involved. Let's take a bit of a look at Hosho. So this is Hosho as brand spanking new. And you can see again that very interesting taper at the forward end of the flight deck and the slope. The slope was effectively there to add as to function as a speed modifier for the very light biplanes that this carrier employed at the time. Compared to Hermes, her island is absolutely tiny. So basically all you've got there is the basic functions of commanding the ship. Very little in the way of air control, air operations. But again, it's a learning experience. Same number of lifts as Hermes. And like the British, the Japanese have adopted, really it was the US method of having a thwart ship arrestor wires. Early British efforts in this direction had used longitudinal guide wires until everyone decided that these were a bit better. But you can also see, like Hermes, she's not got completely built up sides, so there's a fair bit of ventilation around the hangar space, but also lots of deck space. So her somewhat weaker armament comprised four 5.5-inch guns and two 3-inch anti-aircraft guns as completed. I'm just going to see if I can dig. Here we go. Ooh, that's not quite the one I wanted to get you. Sorry, getting my photos mixed up. Now, Hermes can take this as a compliment because she did so much better and got a lot of things right. She remained substantially unaltered throughout her career. In fact, actually, her design was so tight that there wasn't really much room for major refits. And the only really noticeable change by the time of her loss was that probably a few light 20mm anti-aircraft guns were fitted. Hosho, by contrast, goes through a lot of rather dramatic change. So this is in the late 1920s, and the most noticeable thing that's vanished is her island superstructure. The Japanese decided quite early on from trials that actually the thing was a bit more of a hindrance and took up space on the flight deck, so they relocated the bridge functions to a point just below the forward end of the flight deck. It's also around this time that they begin introducing their very, very ingenious hinged radio masts. And of course, you can see this one there hinged down so that it doesn't obstruct the flight deck. And here's a nice look at the funnels. These are still the original funnels that are hinged in the down position so that flight operations can be conducted. But in this photograph, the late 20s, the main change is the fact that the island has gone. Now, if we fast forward to the next decade, here is Hosho again in the 1930s, mid to late 1930s. And you can't see very much of what's going on the starboard side, but the funnels have now been fixed. But what is a bit noticeable is that dip in the flight deck has gone. The flight deck has actually been lengthened. Now, just to give you an idea of how similarly proportioned these ships were, even though Hermes was a bit bigger, Hermes's length overall was 598 foot and her breadth was 70 foot and a bit. And that roughly corresponds to the dimensions of her flight deck. When Hosho began her life with the sloping flight deck, that was about 520 foot, give or take. But if you counted it right to the end of the narrow taper, it was about 540 foot in length by 59 foot in width. This modification, which saw the straightening of the flight deck forward and also the lengthening of the flight deck astern by the 1930s, with that classic sort of downturn that both the Brits and the Japanese loved, that brought Hosho's flight deck up to 551 feet in length, and that would be the length she carried for the rest of her career. And as far as both ships were concerned, this was a very decent length. Bearing in mind at the time both carriers were designed, aircraft were still, the lightweight wooden canvas biplanes. And so it was fairly easy. In fact, actually, if anything, ships of this size were actually quite capacious for the role. But you can also tell how early it was in the game because both sides were not thinking of enormous air complements. Interestingly enough, Hermes was always designed to operate roughly 20 aircraft, and this actually remained her operational maximum throughout her life. And part of the problem was, as aircraft got bigger and more capable, particularly from the mid-1930s onwards, carriers like Hosho and Hermes could not expand to cope. In fact, it's actually fairly miraculous that Hermes maintained the 20 aircraft number, was remarkably stable. Hosho, for her part, went up and down rather dramatically. So, as designed, she was meant to operate around 20 aircraft. But by the late 20s, the Japanese, with a fair bit of imagination, were able to boost this to 26. Now, that needs some qualification. 26 was the maximum number of fuselages that could be carried aboard the Hosho, but an actual operational maximum was roughly 15 or 16. If you wanted to fly off the remainder, you'd have to physically attach their wings first down in the hangar before doing anything with them. But Hosho, because of her slightly smaller size, actually bears the brunt of technological advance more than Hermes does. So by the mid 1930s, her air complement is back down to about 20 aircraft. And with the arrival of metal monoplanes in the Imperial Navy, by 1942, it is just 11 aircraft. Which brings me nicely to the question of how well these chaps represent their parent ships in the game War at Sea. And I'm going to start with the aircraft rating. Now, Victory in the Pacific, sorry, not War at Sea. Victory in the Pacific obviously represents the period December 1941 in the base game through to October 1944. So both ships have an air attack rating of 1, which would normally put them on an equal footing, except Hosho's been credited with the better aircraft / elite pilots bonus. Now, I'm not really sure how I feel about this because having just touched on the aircraft numbers, by 1942, Hosho really is operating only about half the number of aircraft that Hermes is. And even if you look at the types of aircraft, I don't really think that Hosho deserves that very high rating for her air wing. Now, I'll explain why. So, really, by the start of World War II, the only aircraft that Hermes could operate in numbers, i.e., approaching her full capacity of 20, was the Fairey Swordfish. The Swordfish was great because it was a compact torpedo bomber, its wings could fold, and it required very little encouragement to successfully take off, even from a relatively small carrier deck. In fact, it was said on more than one occasion that if the wind over the bow was strong enough, you could actually enjoy the sight of a swordfish almost doing a vertical takeoff. Because it was such a forgiving aircraft to fly. It was not very fast. It didn't need to be. As torpedo bombers go. So Hermes could operate a lot of them. When it came to other Fleet Air Arm aircraft like the Grumman Martlet, which was the British, basically Wildcats in British colours, or the Sea Hurricane or similar planes, Hermes would have struggled to operate nearly as many of them. Now, she did operate those aircraft at different points in her career, but not in enough numbers to make a difference. And when she was actually lost in the spring of 1942, she was actually carrying no aircraft at all, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on how you view these things. Hosho, by 1941, 1942, could only operate small numbers of frontline Japanese aircraft. So the most potent fighters she operated was the A5M Claude, which was the precursor to the Zero, and she'd never had that many of those either. She may have flown off 1 or 2 Zeros on training missions, but that's not really substantiated. There was precious little chance of her flying off the heavy Japanese B5N Kate torpedo bomber. And she could just about manage a few vals, but not in any great, not in any great number. We're talking literal handfuls here. So I can't see how, even if Hosho has a great deal of combat experienced pilots aboard, how she can ever mount enough of an airstrike to merit that. I would suggest a more accurate figure is to actually give each carrier a 1, and Hosho, if you're being generous, can have a 1. What about gunnery? I think this rating is a bit fair with Hermes having 1 and Hosho having 0. So Hermes, as completed, had a battery of 10 5.5-inch guns for anti-surface combat, which was a bit of a weak armament by World War II, but was reasonably respectable. She's possibly overpowered having 1, because that is the same rating that is given to the US Navy's 8-inch treaty cruisers and their Royal Navy equivalents. So 5.5-inch guns on the broadside really isn't up to those. In fact, come to think of it, maybe she should have a 0. Hosho definitely deserves that 0 because she was completed with 4 5.5-inch guns, so the same caliber of weapon that equipped Hermes, but far fewer of them. But by the start of World War II in the Far East, those guns had actually been removed to make way for an anti-aircraft armament. So, quite rightly, Hosho ain't got nothing. What about the survivability ratings? We've got a 2 for Hermes and a 1 for Hosho. Again, it's a difficult one in this case because Hermes was undeniably a better constructed aircraft carrier than Hosho. She had more subdivision, she had better pumping systems, they were certainly more extensive. And she was really designed to take it much more than the Hosho. But in terms of flood resistance, I would say her advantage was not that huge. I, it's very hard to judge these things in hindsight because of the very different internal layouts of the two ships. However, one huge advantage that Hermes did have, which Hosho did not, was armor. So, as completed, Hermes enjoyed belt armor 3 inches thick, which is not that great, but it's better than nothing. And in another innovation, which was really forward thinking when she came into being, when the design was first conceived, she had 1 inch deck armor. Hosho, as I say, had absolutely nothing and was a bit of a tin can by comparison. Um, Hosho, perhaps fortunately for her crew, her armor was never tested in battle. No Allied aircraft really came near her until very late in the war, and she managed to survive that and ended up being a repatriation ship after from 1945 onwards. Hermes was subjected to the most severe of tests in April 1942, a test which she failed, understandably, when during the height of the Indian Ocean raid, when Admiral Nagumo went rampaging through the Indian Ocean with 5 of his fleet aircraft carriers, Hermes was unfortunately caught out of position. I'd mentioned a few minutes ago she had no aircraft on her when she was sunk. This was because she'd landed her Swordfish at Ceylon to beef up the remains of the RAF and Fleet Air Arm aircraft there that had already suffered heavily from Japanese raids. And she was caught by Japanese dive bombers, basically steaming south, trying to lose herself in the vastness of the Indian Ocean. And she was sunk in very short order indeed. But bear in mind, this was the cream of the crop of the Imperial Navy's premier carrier force. So it was almost mathematical in its certainty that Hermes would not survive. And as proved, she didn't. But yes, there we go. So meandering painfully back to whether the 2-1 is justified. I'm going to say I think the game designers have been over generous. There are other ships in the game that have a defensive rating of 0, which means they're basically sunk on the first hit. I would suggest that Hosho really should belong into that category. But in the same breath, I would also suggest that Hermes should be downgraded to a 1, because giving her a protective rating of 2 puts her on the same level as some of the large fleet carriers in this game. And I'm pretty sure that ain't right. So, yeah, just a gentle suggestion that both of those are scaled back. And lastly, there's their speed rating of 4 each, which again is fair. Hermes was designed to make 25 knots, and so was Hosho. And both carriers, much to their credit, generally maintained that level of capability throughout their careers. Hermes never had a problem reaching or maintaining 25 knots. She was one of those ships whose machinery did very well. Hosho was subject to frequent upgrades, but generally speaking, she did the same. She managed to crank out 25 knots whenever it was required of her. And it probably, I mean, if for no other virtue than she was the only flight deck available for this purpose during the Midway operation, maybe that was why Hosho was selected to accompany the main body, i.e., Yamamoto's battleships, during the Midway operation, because she could keep up with ships like Yamato when they were steaming at economical speed. So, and that, of course, was, as I alluded to earlier, her only combat, well, no, her final combat operation in the Pacific War. Thereafter, she reverted to training and increasingly to trying to keep away from the US Navy as best she could. She didn't do too badly there. So, relative to the other ships in the game, which are capable of these sorts of speeds, it's a bit of a tricky one because the slower Japanese battleships and the old British Revenge class, the Royal Sovereigns, they're rated with a speed of 4 as well. So, I mean, I certainly agree that Hosho and Hermes should have equivalent speed ratings. There's no doubt about that. But I wonder whether maybe both of them should be a 5 rather than a 4. I think the game's been very slightly unkind to them on the speed front there, because certainly Hermes, if you gave her enough time and a long enough run, could leave the Revengers behind. And the same was true of Hosho with some of the older Japanese battle wagons. I mean, if she was given enough time to really get up to sprinting speed, then, old timers like Fuso and Yamashiro would have struggled a bit to keep up with her. So, but yes, I'll leave it at that. 4 is good as a speed rating. 5 would possibly do. So, lots of tweaks there. But I think the biggest offence really is the strength of Hosho's air group, because that puts her on a par with the very capable Japanese light carriers, Shoho and Zuiho, which is definitely not right. But other than that, I think it's not too bad as a representation of both these vessels, at least relative to one another. Change the air wing if I feel that strongly about it. But there we go. That covers a very, very potted history of two of naval history's most fascinating aircraft carriers. I hope I've done them justice. As always with these things, you feel there's more you can say, but you just haven't got round to it. But I hope that gives you all a good idea of the pros and cons of how they've been represented in Victory in the Pacific. And it only remains for me to say a huge thank you to all of you who've followed this video, stuck with me. Thank you so much for your company and the time you've spent watching this. I really appreciate it. It's always great fun to have you guys on board. To my very long-suffering veterans, hey guys, hello. I hope you're all doing really well, and I hope you've enjoyed this. To anyone who's new visiting my channel for the first time, I hope you found this video interesting. If you came here for Victory in the Pacific, please do have a look at the other videos I've made on this wonderful classic of a game. I do love it very much, even though I have enjoyed picking holes in some of the ratings here today. If it's wargaming in general, please do meander around the rest of the channel. I hope you'll find something that you enjoy. But to all of you, as always, thanks again. I can't ever thank you guys enough. Always for the pleasure of your company. It makes these videos and the task of making them so worthwhile. As always, really look forward to any feedback you might feel you want to offer, comments, queries, interesting stuff you happen to know about these two ships. I'm always up for learning more about them, so please do whack something in the comments if you'd like to. But whoever you are and wherever you're watching from, thank you so much again, and I look forward to seeing you guys in my next video. Take care. Bye.